Welcome to the Compliance 911 Show, a no-nonsense podcast discussing hot topics for today's busy compliance professional. It's everything you wanted to know about regulatory compliance, but we're afraid to ask. And now, here are your hosts, Dean Stockford of M&amp Consulting and Len Suzio of GeoDataVision.
Welcome to our podcast, everything you wanted to know about regulatory compliance, but we're afraid to ask. Okay, Len, what's today's exciting topic?
I don't know if it's exciting or it's just scary, but now that the Trump administration has announced its intention to repeal the 2023 CRA rule, many bankers are way too eager to move on and forget about the soon-to-be repealed rule. It was unbelievably complex, confusing, and intimidating. Good riddance to bad rubbish, many would say. But it would be a mistake to overlook some valuable insights hidden in the 2023 CRA rule. Insights that can be applied to the legacy CRA rule and CRA in general.
Well, you've certainly provoked my curiosity. So what insights can be learned from the rule about to be repealed?
Dean, I believe there are several potentially valuable insights that could be taken from the 23 CRA rule, notwithstanding the fact that it should be repealed before the end of the year. First, I believe there is something to be learned about how regulators measure and value different performance levels. I also believe that the 23 CRA rule provides perspective on how regulators consider consumer loans for CRA purposes.
Well, I think you have our listeners' attention, and you definitely have my attention on this because we've been hoping for some level of repeal, but at the same time, I'm cautious about that. So let's start with how the regulators value different performance levels overall.
Yes, Dean, as you know, the 23 CRA rule incorporated specific numerical performance results and translated those results into, quote, supporting conclusions and, quote, recommended conclusions, which is another way of saying performance ratings. The rule contains what it described as calibrated benchmarks. This truly is a breakthrough in terms of measuring CRA performance. Ever since the major revisions to the CRA rule was announced in 1995, we've known that the regulators compute a bank's performance in comparison to the market activity of other reporting lenders, as well as to selected demographic variables. But regulators never announced how they converted the comparisons to performance ratings. For example, examiners will take a bank's penetration rate extending HMDA reported mortgages or CRA reported small business loans in an assessment area's low and moderate income tracts and compare it to that of other lenders active within the defined community. So if a bank extended 5% of its mortgages in the low income tracts, the market extended 9% of its mortgage originations in the assessment area low income tracts, we would know that the bank underperformed relative to the market's average experience. But what we didn't know was what was needed to achieve a, quote, satisfactory performance rating. We didn't know how close to the market average low income tract penetration rate a bank had to be to achieve at least a low satisfactory performance rating. And adding to the confusion has been the fact that examiners also have been comparing a bank's low and moderate income tract census tract penetration rates to selected market demographics. Another good example can be seen in the geographic distribution test, in which our sample bank had extended only 5% of its mortgages in the low income tracts. Now, the examiners will compare that result against the geographic distribution of owner-occupied housing in the defined community's low-income neighborhoods. So in our example, if only 4% of the owner-occupied housing is in the low-income tracts, it means that the bank outperformed the demographic or, quote, community, end quote, variable. Now that you have two different comparative results, with one test underperforming relative to a market benchmark and another test overperforming relative to the demographic benchmark, the big question was, how would a bank's performance be rated? The 2023 CRA rule provided very specific answers to that question. And the 2023 CRA rule also specified what the priorities were to be when you get conflicting performance ratings. These results would be used for the major performance measurements under the so-called lending test. That is the geographic and the so-called borrower characteristics distribution test.
Okay, so to make sure that I, and of course the audience, understand you correctly on what you're saying, the 23 rule provides a measurement scale that enables a banker to determine if their bank passes or fails lending tests when compared to other banks and when compared to the community's demographics overall.
Yes, and in fact, Dean, it's even better than that. The calibrated standards specified in the rule apply to all 5 different performance ratings: outstanding, high satisfactory, low satisfactory, needs to improve, and substantial noncompliance. So you can do much more than treating CRA as a quote pass fail test. You can compute your exact CRA performance rating. And by the way, it makes very clear what the priorities are when you are looking at conflicting results between different calibrated standards, as in the case of our theoretical example. The 2023 CRA rule said that the best performance, quote, supporting conclusion would be used to determine the performance rating.
Okay, so maybe I'm just a little bit confused, but aren't the 23 CRA performance measurements or reference points different from the legacy CRA rule?
No, actually, Dean, the 2 rules are nearly identical. The legacy and the 2023 CRA rule both measure lending under the so-called geographic distribution test and the borrower characteristics test. The first test focuses on lending in the low and moderate income areas, and the second test examines performance lending to low and moderate income mortgage borrowers or very small business or small farm borrowers. And both performance evaluation systems use the same reference points. That is, performance comparison to other lenders and the same community demographic variables. The big difference is that the 2023 CRA rule contains a numerical performance rating system that allows the calculation of, quote, conclusions that convert to performance ratings for the first time in CRA history.
So, do you think that when I should say, I don't want to say if, but do you think when
Yeah.
the notice of proposed rule making is published, that it will retain the calibrated benchmarks in the 23 rule that we're speaking of?
Well, that's anybody's guess. But since the legacy rule has never had any calibration points, the regulators wouldn't have to officially declare them. They could simply and quietly adopt them without any fanfare. It would be completely legitimate since there never have been any official published standards. For all we know, those standards have actually been used by examiners for years. If the 2023 CRA rules performance value system represents how regulators value results, why would those values be any different from what they unofficially practice already? But even if the regulators don't use any precise mathematical standards, examiners have to be working off some unofficial internal guidance. Ask an examiner what you'd have to do to get a satisfactory performance rating under any CRA test, and they won't give you a specific answer. The lack of some guidance for examiners potentially would lead to widely different and inconsistent performance ratings. Now, of course, some people complain that is part of the problem with the CRA exams. But I believe examiners are given wide discretion when finalizing performance ratings. That's what leads to inconsistent performance ratings, not the lack of some internal guidance system. So it boils down to this. For bankers, using the 2023 CRA performance system is better than nothing. For the last 30 years, banks have been working in a vacuum without even a hint of how to convert performance comparisons to some performance rating. Now, the 2023 CRA measurement system at least gives an approximation of how a banker can estimate their bank's performance may be rated, even under the legacy CRA rule. As the saying goes, something is better than nothing.
Yeah, well, I think you may be right about that, even though we've, of course, had many discussions around some of the flaws and the things we don't like in that rule. But one of the most common complaints, Len, I've heard from CRA officers for many years is the vagueness in those performance standards. Everyone has a sort of a feel for what might be satisfactory, even though, again, you can't point to anything specific. But that's about it. It would be much more desirable, I think, to everybody to have a way to convert comparisons into actual meaningful ratings. And I also, said something about, or I think you said something about perhaps consumer loans.
Yes, Dean, that's correct. As you know, consumer loans are, quote, optional under CRA, unless their omission in a CRA exam would distort a bank's performance, meeting the credit needs of the community. Generally, that means those loans constitute a very large percentage, maybe 50% of a bank's lending, in which case the evaluation of those loans would be mandatory for a CRA exam. Typically, this happens with automobile lending. In fact, we have a West Coast client that does almost all automobile lending. So all their CRA exams include the automobile loans. Now, the 2023 CRA rule does keep auto loans as loans to be evaluated when they constitute a, quote, major product line, end quote, which is defined as 15% of loans based on an average, computed using the number of loans and the value of loans compared to HMDA and small business. But it eliminates even the possibility of using any type of consumer loans under the retail lending test. That was a shocker to me when I first read that. Instead, if a large bank wants its consumer loans to be evaluated for CRA examination purposes, their qualitative value will be considered under the retail products and services test, not the lending test. That was explicitly or is explicitly in the CRA, the 2023 CRA rule. The explanation in the 2023 CRA preamble is that consumer loans are too, quote, heterogeneous to be able to develop consistent performance comparisons and evaluate results. Historically, we've always encouraged our clients who engage in a significant level of consumer lending to collect the data and determine if the results help their performance. And if it did, then they could voluntarily submit them for a CRA exam. But now that we've learned about how little the regulators value consumer loans, we are not going to be recommending that our clients bother collecting the data and evaluating their impact on CRA performance, unless they are automobile loans that account for 15% or more of their CRA-related lending. So it's important for bankers to understand now that consumer loans are really devalued by the regulators as part of CRA performance ratings.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. I think you're right that this is very interesting and informative for all of our audience. And I also believe it takes or gives bankers, I should say, something to think about, especially if they repeal or replace, but to try to self-assess their CRA performance in anticipation of their next CRA exam. I believe that this guidance that you're providing would be very, very helpful. This is Dean Stockford saying thank you to Len for this great presentation today, and thank you for all tuning in. But this is Dean Stockford from M&amp Consulting.
And this is Len Suzio with GeoDataVision saying we hope you found today's podcast informative and helpful. Please let us know of any topics you would like us to address in future podcasts.
Thanks for listening to the Compliance 911 Show. If you like the podcast, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. While you're at it, please give us a like and review to help others find the show. As always, links are in the show notes, and you can always find us online at compliance911show.com. Follow M&amp Consulting and GeoDataVision on LinkedIn for all the latest news and information on compliance hot topics.